All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Hopefully, maybe a couple more people will show up here. We had quite a few signed up. But I'd like to thank everybody for attending today's SAVI webinar. Today, we'll be talking about SAVI's Community Assessment Tool. It's one of our newest tools that we have for SAVI users. My name is Jay Colbert. I work here at the Polis Center. Most of my duties revolve around getting the data that's in SAVI into SAVI. So if you have any questions today, feel free to type them out in the chat log, and I'll try to keep an eye on that and answer questions as they come up. And other than that, I guess we can go ahead and get going. So here's what we'll be talking about today. We'll talk about community assessments in general, and then why you might want to do a community assessment, what steps are involved in creating that assessment, and then specifically we'll talk about using SAVI's community assessment tool. So let's talk about community assessments in general. Why would you want to do a community assessment? So above all, you would want to do a community assessment so you can make data-informed decisions rather than just relying on intuition or making guesses about what's going on in your community. I would always highly recommend using some form of data in your assessments and in your decision making. You can also do an assessment to evaluate the reach of your current existing programs. An assessment can also tell you what needs are present in a community. You can also do that assessment to establish priority areas and then to strategically target outreach programs and services. So here are some basic steps for doing an assessment, and we'll talk about each of these steps in a little bit more detail during the webinar today. So step one is defining scope. Step two, assessing existing needs in the community. Step three, identifying assets. Step four, identifying barriers and challenges. And step five, analyzing gaps. And when I say gaps there, that's really the gaps between existing assets in an area and those needs in an area as well. Then step six is really kind of when you're getting ready to create and share your assessment. And so step six is defining opportunities and prioritizing. So step one, defining scope. When I say define scope, I really mean three different things. One is a geographic area, such as a neighborhood or township or county that you're actually going to be doing your work in, focusing your efforts in. And then two is population. So maybe you're just going to help seniors or children or minorities. And then third is the topic. So you're going to focus on health or education or hunger or some other thing. So just keep in mind that you can't do everything for everybody everywhere. So by definition, you have to define that scope to limit it to something where you can actually make a difference within your scope. Step two, identifying needs. So we do step two so we can understand the issues in the community. So what is the current state in the community? How has it changed over time? Has it been getting better? Has it been getting worse? Who is impacted by this issue? And then does it differ by geography? So one thing you might be looking at in a community assessment is poverty. So I could tell you that the poverty rate in Marion County is about 20%. And so, is that good? Is that bad? Well, I could decide that by comparing that to other counties or larger geographies such as a state and so on. And is it getting worse? Is it getting better? And so on. Then also, another important factor there is understanding what it means to be in poverty. So for example, the current poverty rate for a family of four is about $23,000 of income a year. So it's easy to understand if you're at that poverty level that you would be forced making some pretty difficult decisions as well. So I have some examples of a demographic profile that we did as part of a community assessment for Washington Township. So once we did this community assessment in Washington Township, we were able to say a certain number of things about it. So in Washington Township, it has a higher than Marion County average for income and educational attainment, and then also for senior citizens. So, that's good for Washington Township that they have a higher income than Marion County on average, and then higher educational attainment as well. Then they also have lower than the Marion County average for unemployment, poverty, and crime. So again, those are good things for Washington Township. And from this, we can see that in those types of measures, they're doing better than Marion County as a whole. You can also see other things as well. So for example, Washington Township isn't all that racially or ethnically diverse, but there are pockets of Hispanic population and pockets of Burmese refugee population that you can also pick up on as you look into the data for Washington Township. And we made a few maps of Washington Township. So here we're looking at unemployment rate, and really what the map is showing is the unemployment rate for adults with no high school diploma. And so we all know that higher education can lead to lower unemployment, but it's always good to have some data to back that up and to show to what extent that's actually true. So for example, in Cooked Creek, we see the overall unemployment rate is 10.5%, but for those without a high school diploma, it's much higher, 37.4%. So this is a good way to kind of show the importance of education in an area. But even though Washington Township's doing pretty good in a lot of areas, there are still some needs that aren't quite being met. And we'll talk about some 211 call data that we get from Connect to Help during the webinar today. And through that data, we were able to identify that those needs that most frequently go unmet are related to housing, utilities, holiday assistance, food, clothing, and legal issues. And we'll talk a little bit more about 211 data later on in the webinar. So step 3, identifying existing assets and resources. So what is already being done to address those needs that we've identified that exist in an area? And one way you can do this is by doing an asset inventory. So when we do that, we want to look at service providers, existing service providers that are in the area. There might be government programs, there might be some volunteers that you can call on as well. And really want to identify what groups of people are served by these resources. So what we did here was asset inventory. This actually comes from some work we did in Hancock County where we were looking at hunger-related issues. And we want to identify programs that existed to help meet those hunger needs in Hancock County. So we identified a group of food pantries. There's a food stamp program there as well, and then there's also some hot meals and food voucher programs as well. And a lot of these asset data can be had from SAVI. Sometimes though there might be some resources out there that aren't available in SAVI, then you have to be a little bit more creative in finding other sources if you really want to fill in those possible data gaps that might exist in an area. So for example, and we'll see some of these maps in the next few slides where we're trying to identify food pantries. And so a lot of that data comes from 211 Connect to Help. But they might not know about every single food pantry out there. So we also engage with like Gleaners Food Banks and Midwest Food Bank to identify food pantries that we otherwise may not have been aware of. So there are a lot of times in doing a community assessment where you have to hit up, multiple sources to try to get that picture as complete as possible. So here's a map that we made going back to Washington Township, where we identified 42 pantries that were either inside or within 2 miles of Washington Township. And so we see there's a couple different things going on this map. The background map is showing annual food need in pounds of food. And that's really driven by the poverty rate is how that's calculated. Then we also have points on the map that represent different food pantries. And some of these food pantries are supplied by Gleaners Food Bank, and several pantries were supplied by sources other than Gleaners. And so we're able to identify on the map which pantries are supplied by which food banks. So step 3 was identifying those assets. Step 4 is where we're conducting a gap analysis. So we've identified some needs, we've identified some resources, but now we want to try to understand how much of a gap there is there between those existing resources and the needs in the neighborhood. So there's a lot of different ways you can define those gaps. You can slice them up by demographics. So perhaps certain populations are more affected by an issue such as poverty than other groups. So if you're looking at poverty, you'll probably find that minorities are more affected by poverty, as well as children will tend to be much more likely to be affected by poverty than adult and senior populations. And also we'll see other issues that might create service gaps. So you might have some existing resources in an area that need them, but there are issues that could limit their ability to serve people. So there might be accessibility issues, availability issues such as what hours a food pantry is open, and capacity. So some food pantries, can be pretty large operations, and others, are can be very small, and they might just not have a lot of capacity to be able to help a lot of people. So knowing that a asset exists is one thing. Understanding their capacity to actually help people is something that's completely different. Some programs will have eligibility requirements, so they might require people to have some kind of income verification to use the food pantry, and while others, it's just done on the honor system. If somebody comes saying they have some kind of food need, then they'll go ahead and serve those people. And also another issue is utilization. So just because a program exists and somebody can utilize that program doesn't mean that it's actually going to get utilized. So one good example of that is free and reduced lunch in schools. So you might have so many students that are eligible for free or reduced lunch, but then it's just a subset of those that actually make use of that program. So if you can do something to increase utilization of an existing program, that might be a lot easier than creating a new program from scratch. And then here's another map that we did in conjunction with the group that does food pantry type work. So they have one main food pantry that served Washington Township, but then they were interested in opening possibly 1 or 2 satellite food pantries. And so the question is, where should those new food pantries go? And so we made a map of their existing food pantry clients, and from that map we could see that looked like there were a couple of concentrations of food pantry clients. So here in northwestern Washington Township, and then also in southeastern Washington Township. So we see there's a fair number of food pantry clients down here represented by the red dots, but there's also a lot of food pantries there as well. So maybe that's a place where existing services are meeting that need. And then we look in northwestern Washington Township, we see a lot of clients, but then only a handful of existing food pantries, and we see they're non-gleaner, so it might be logical that they would have less capacity than gleaner supplied food pantries as well. So from a map like this, if you're going to make the decision to locate a satellite food pantry, the logical spot seems like it would be up here somewhere in northwestern Washington Township. So step 5, identifying barriers and challenges and identifying other information. And this kind of goes in with that gap analysis in general. You might think of it more as the why of that gap than the what of the gap. So why are these gaps happening? So what is preventing people from accessing or using the existing services, and what other challenges might people be facing? And a good way to understand that why is by collecting more information. So you can do this from a lot of different sources. So, you could collect data that already exists, from SAVI or the Census Bureau and sources like that. Then you can also collect your own data as well by doing things such as completing surveys, doing interviews with people, or convening focus groups as well. So a lot of times that type of information, might lead to anecdotal type evidence, but anecdotal type evidence can be really good at identifying what kind of questions you should be asking. So if your focus groups and interviewees are all talking about, hunger in an area or poverty in an area, then that might let you know that those are the issues that you want to focus on. So there's a lot of barriers that could drive the whys of those gaps. So for example, transportation, if you're running programs geared towards low-income people, it's very possible they won't have a car, so that makes that transportation and accessibility issues a lot more prominent. Another issue is awareness. So there might be a food pantry that exists in a church down the road that they run on the weekends or in the evenings or whatever. But if people don't know about it, it doesn't do you any good. So sometimes just creating that awareness will also help increase utilization of existing sources. So other issues that could be specific to food pantries are things such as limited availability. So a lot of food pantries might not be open on the weekends or in the evening. So if you have a working family that still needs some help, it would be a lot harder for them to make use of those resources if they're just open when they're at work anyway. Some services will have eligibility restrictions such as income verification and whatnot. And other resources might be less accessible if they're not on a bus route. So the last step in this community assessment is defining opportunities and prioritizing your efforts. So this is where you're creating your assessment and you're sharing those results. So you want to create awareness in the community of what's going on. This could be awareness of what challenges exist in that community, what resources also exist in the community, and then what factors might be creating gaps between those two things. Also outreaching to potential partners, so you can identify assets within SAVI and SAVI's community assessment tool to see what food pantries are already out there. Maybe you can engage with them, see what kind of lessons they've learned, see how perhaps their efforts can be supplemented, and so on. Now, that's also goes to assessing willingness to collaborate with some of these existing resources. So perhaps you have the resources to run a food pantry, but you don't necessarily have a location. So maybe you can identify possible partners where you could use some of their space, such as a church or a library or something like that, where you could run your food pantry within their space. So there's a lot of data that goes on with a community assessment, and one of the things you'll hear people say is secondary data first and then primary data second. So secondary data is data that someone else has already collected. So if you went to SAVI to get data or you went to the Census Bureau to get data, then you're getting secondary data in that situation. So secondary data is good because it's easy and cheap usually. You can just go download the data and then be on your way. The limitation there is that it might not be exactly what you want or how you want the data. And in those cases where you still have some gaps to fill in, you might want to then do primary data. And primary data is any data that you go out and collect on your own, whether it's through surveys or interviews or focus groups. So primary data is good because you can do that however you want. You can ask whatever questions you want and so on, but it's bad because it's a lot of work. It's a lot more work to go out and collect that data on your own than it is to just go download data that somebody else already collected. And then don't forget data that might already exist in your organization. So perhaps you're already running that food pantry and you've kept track of clients, including their addresses. So that's data that you can manipulate, map those address locations and see where your clients are concentrated and things like that. So let's talk about the community assessment tool in SAVI. So these are the steps of that community assessment tool, and they're pretty similar to the steps we just talked about, but specific to SAVI's community assessment tool. And we'll talk about each of these steps. So we're going to define the scope, assess the needs in an area, identify the existing assets. Then step 4 will be defining gaps and opportunities. This step 4 is more on you, where you're kind of doing some thinking about the data that you've collected. And then step 5 is really the end goal here of the SAVI community assessment. So we'll be doing some things in the assessment, and at the very end you download a Microsoft Word document that has components of this assessment already filled in, and then it's editable at that point, and you can go ahead and make your changes, fill in all the gaps that need to be filled in for creating your community assessment. So this tool, the SAVI's assessment tool, it is a tool that you have to be logged in, you have to be registered and logged in to use. So if you want to follow along and do some clicking on your own, you can open up a web browser and go to assessment.savi.org, or if you're already in regular SAVI, there should be a tab there. You would click on Use SAVI to make sure you can see the tools, and then click on the Assessment tab, which brings you here. Now, one thing to keep in mind, even if you're in regular SAVI and then logged in, and you go to the assessment tool, you have to log in again. And so you go to assessment.savi.org, and it starts by clicking this login button up here, and it's just your same regular SAVI login. Hopefully everybody has that login ready to go if you want to follow along. If not, you can just watch the slides and then do some practice on your own later. But again, it's just your regular SAVI login when you log into the assessment tool. Yeah, so here it is. We've clicked the login button, and you enter in your username or your email address and your password. If you've forgotten your password, you can retrieve it with the forgot your password link, or if you need to register, you can click on that create account and then register as a SAVI user. So once you log in, it'll take you to the beginning of the assessment tool. This here, you're on the Start Your Assessment tab. And then once you've created a few assessments, you will see them listed down here. And you can create as many assessments as you want. And we're not going to be deleting anybody's assessment, so you can create as many as you'd like here, and they'll always be here in the assessment tool. So when you create your first assessment, you're going to fill in these 3 text boxes here. So one, that first text box is the assessment name. The second box is your geography name. Now when you do this geography name, you want to be thoughtful with it. You want it to be, because you're going to see this geography name in your visualizations and in your community assessment when you download it. So you want that geography name to be meaningful, but also brief, because you don't want to take up a bunch of space in all your visualizations that you'll see later on. Then you also give your assessment a purpose there as well. Yeah, so you can save as many assessments as you like, and then once you get this far, you get all your information filled out, you're going to click the next button here to move on to the next step. So the next step here is defining the scope. And within SAVI's community assessment tool, when I say define scope, I really mean the geographic scope. And then it's kind of on you to define the scope for the population and the topic that you're working on. So maybe I'm just looking at poverty for children. But that's on you, but here's where you select your geographic scope. And it's real similar if you've used the SAVI Community Profiles tool. It's just a matter of clicking on the map to select the area that you want. So here we're doing counties, and this area here happens to be the United Way of Central Indiana service area, those 6 counties. So if you want to do a different area, a different geography type, you can, and these are the geographies that you can do. You can do counties, townships, school corporations, and census tracts. And to do that, you just click this drop down here to change your geography type. And then again, you just click on the map to select the area that you want, or if you want to select from a list. So maybe you have a list of census tract numbers, but you don't know exactly where they are. You can just click on the list here next to the tract numbers that you need. And then as you do that, those areas will also be highlighted on the map, and vice versa. As you click on the map, they get checked over in the list here. So we go through, we select all our geographies, clicking on the map or clicking on the list. Now we click the next button here, or the save button does the same thing for you. Now when you do that, you're going to get a few alerts here. So one, it's going to ask, are you sure? Because once you create this assessment, you cannot alter the definition of your geography once you've created it. So if something does happen, you realize it was just wrong or whatever, you have to start over and create a new assessment if you want to do a different geography. So say, are you sure? You click confirm. Then it'll give you a couple other alerts. One being we're going to capture a screenshot of your map and include that in your assessment. And then finally, it tells you that we're creating a printable assessment report in Word that you're going to download later. So you go through these 3 check boxes, clicking OK on each one. It takes a minute or so to get through all that because we're creating so many things in the background. But once you do get through those 3 checkboxes, the next step is step 2, assessing needs. And this is where you start to get to some of the fancy stuff with these visualizations. Now, this is what we call the dashboard. And this dashboard is where we're throwing a bunch of numbers at you. And there's a lot of stuff going on here. So let's talk about what you'll see at this point. So one, you'll see that geography name that we created earlier. So this was United Way Central Indiana Service Area. I typed that geography name in, and then it's shown to me here. So I kind of know that all the numbers here that I'm looking at relate to the area that I defined in step 1. And so what I have here are a bunch of indicators on the left going down, and then across the top I have different types of populations. So this first column is the total population. So I know that the total population in this area is a little over 1.5 million. I can see that the percent of that population that is minority is about 29%. The median age in that area is 35. The population is projected to grow to almost 1.9 million by 2030. It's grown 19% since 2000. And I get other pieces of information here too. So for example, unemployment rate in that area is 9%. And 64% of the population lives in owner-occupied housing. And then I can start to slice this up different ways. I can slice it up by demographics, by age, race, and gender. So here's where I can start to see some disparities out there. So if I look at the unemployment rate, for example, I can see that in this area, the unemployment rate for the white population is 7%, but then for the black population, it's higher at 18%. Then I can also see how all these other indicators vary by age, race, and gender. Now I can also slice this up by socioeconomic status in the form of poverty and educational attainment. So again, looking at this unemployment rate, I can see that the unemployment rate for a population with a bachelor's degree or higher is 3%. And the unemployment rate for the population with no high school diploma is a lot higher at 16%. So we already knew that education will lead to lower unemployment, but this is a good way to visualize it and then confirm to what extent that's actually true. And it's also useful for convincing other people of that importance as well. And when you can, put some solid numbers on how much of a difference something like education can make in something like unemployment, it becomes really useful. And we can also see that higher education leads to higher, or at least there's a correlation between higher education and higher rates of owner-occupied housing as well. Now the colors that you see here also mean something. So red, if it's red, you know that it's getting worse. If it's blue, you know that it's getting better. So for example, we see that for the unemployment rate, it's been getting worse for pretty much everybody except we see for the Hispanic population. So we see the unemployment rate for Hispanic population is 9, and that has been improving over time. So then you probably ask, well, what period of time has that been improving for? And the comparison is always made from the most current year to 2010. So 2010 is the baseline year that we're using. And then the most recent year for most of this stuff right now is 2015. So that's the dashboard, and we'll see a little bit more stuff in here. The dashboard can be a little challenging the first time you see it, understanding which direction all this stuff is going. So if you have doubts in the future, feel free to call or email, and we can talk about what you're seeing there. So we have about 80 different general metrics on that dashboard, and if you've seen it before, United Way used to do every few years a paper report of a community assessment for their whole area. And it was enormous, and just the executive summary was a book that was pretty thick, and to see the whole thing, you had to get it on a CD. And so we built this tool in collaboration with them as a digital replacement of that book, which they had not done the book for a long time anyway, because they'd been wanting to go to this digital solution. So if you're familiar with that or familiar with United Way in general, you'll see that a lot of the categories on the dashboard follow closely to United Way's categories. Their main categories are basic needs, financial stability, health, and education. So financial stability includes things like income and employment and those sorts of things. Now you can start to drill down deeper into the data and get some more detail about what's going on. So here's an example of poverty rate in the United Way Central Indiana service area. And we can see that the poverty rates vary a lot by race and ethnicity, with the white population having a poverty rate of 10%, and then minority populations having a much higher poverty rate. Then you also see similar patterns by age as well, where young people are generally always much more likely to be in poverty than senior citizens. And you can also view this by those socioeconomic status slices as well. So we can see that the poverty rate, and this mirrors the unemployment rate. The poverty rate is much higher for those with less education than those with more education. So let's say we want to know more about the poverty rate. We want to see some visualizations related just to poverty. We can click this yellow plus sign here next to the indicator for poverty rate or any other indicator that you're interested in. And it's going to bring up the visualizations related to that indicator. So here we see a chart that shows the percent of population in poverty from our baseline year to our most recent year. And this chart says 14, but the live data out there actually goes through 2015 now. So we see our geography that we did earlier, United Way Central Indiana service area, is in the yellow. And then we throw in a couple comparison geographies for you as well, which is the Indianapolis metropolitan area, the 11 county area. So we see that's pretty close to the United Way service area. Then we also throw in the state of Indiana as a comparison as well. So we can see in all these areas, poverty was going up during this time, but we see that in the Indianapolis Metro and United Way area, it's a little bit lower than it was for Indiana as a whole. Yeah, so notice that the geography name that you typed in shows up twice in this visualization. You see it up here in the title, and then you also see it in the legend here. So that's why it's important to pick a meaningful but brief geography name. Now I can also view this by different slices within the visualization as well. So I can generally slice this by age, race, gender, and educational attainment within these visualizations. So that's going to vary from data set to data set. And sometimes we get the data in a way we can look at these slices, and other times you cannot. So here I've changed the drill down to age. And so now I'm looking at just the United Way Central Indiana service area. All the other geography comparisons fall away at this point, and we're just looking at different age groups over time in my geographic area. So here I can see how poverty varies by age. So those youngest people are always most likely to be in poverty, with population under age 5 and under 18. And these are adults. And then these are seniors, where we see that poverty rate for them is low, and it continues to drop a little bit over time, where it's going up for everybody else. If you click on the bar graph tab, you'll get a bar graph that includes your geographic area and then comparison geographies. Here it's Indiana and the Indianapolis metropolitan area. And then depending on how many geographies actually make up your area, you might get those in this chart as well. So here we see those 6 counties that make up the United Way service area. Now I can see within that area, Marion County is the one that has the highest poverty rate, while the others are quite a bit lower. You can also click on the data table, which gives you all the numbers at once. You'll typically get a poverty rate plus a count of population and poverty. Not all the data. A lot of the data comes to us from the American Community Survey from Census Bureau. And that data, if you're familiar with it, has margins of error. So if we have that margin of error available to us, we'll share it with you, and you'll know it's at with that plus or minus symbol right there. So I mentioned that 211 call data. Let me talk about that in a little bit more detail. So Connect to Help tracks all the calls that come in. They know the race and gender of those that call. They know what category they're calling about, and they know if they're able to assist the caller in connecting with an agency that could help their specific need. So here we see that these calls are broken out by quarter. So there is a certain number of calls. There's always more needs, because each call could have multiple needs within the call. And we see how that's broken out by race and by gender. And so you can tell by looking at this that females are a lot more likely to call Connect to Help than are males. And when these calls come in, they keep track on if they're able to assist the caller or not. And that shows up as the dark blue portion of the bar. And for those needs that were unmet, that is the light blue portion of the bar. So you can tell a few things from looking at this chart. You can see that most of their calls revolve around basic needs, which are going to be things like food, clothing, shelter. And you can also see the other categories here as well. So the smallest number of calls come in for education. You can see they're pretty good about meeting the needs of most of these calls, but the one that looks like has the most unmet needs actually deal with basic needs. You can also view maps of the data by clicking on that map tab. And here's telling you percent of population in poverty. And you can see where the concentrations of poverty are in the area. And you also have this drop down here, so you can change the year of the data. And depending on what slice you're looking at, you can pick it by race and a lot of different slices, depending on what indicator you're looking at and what drill down you have selected here. Now also notice as you're looking at these visualizations that you have a couple of buttons up here, export and add to report. So if you click export, you just download an image of the visualization that you're looking at. It's a PNG file, and you can take it and do whatever you like with it. If you click add to report, it adds it to that Word document that you download at the end. So Some things are added automatically, and other things you have to add. And so the things that are added automatically is an overview map of the area that you selected. So that goes in automatically. And also that needs dashboard that we saw in step 2, that goes in automatically as well. Anything else that you want in your report, you got to click that add to report button. So you're on that map or you're on that visualization, click add to report, and you'll see this box open up that has the map or chart or whatever you're looking at in there. Now at this point you have the option of adding some text to your visualization. So that might be an opportunity for you to explain to others why you think that visualization is relevant or important. Now keep in mind you don't have to do that now, adding that text. You always have that opportunity at the end when you download the Word document. But if you want to do it while it's in your mind, you can add it here. So if you make changes to this, you got to click that Save Report button so you can save your changes, and then making changes or not, you got to click that Cancel button to make that window go away. So once you do that, it'll be added to your report, and you'll see it again in the last step. So moving on to step 3, that's identifying assets, identifying those existing assets already in the community. And you'll see this step revolves around the map here. And you get a background map here that you can select what indicators go in there. The one indicator that goes in there. So here it's poverty rate. So we know that the darker areas have higher poverty. There's a drop down here. You can select other things. I think there's unemployment rate in there and a few other indicators as well. And then the other thing you can put on the map are the assets. So that's just a matter of clicking on these categories. So again, these are categories that should be familiar to you if you're familiar with that United Way data. And it's just a matter of clicking these check boxes for the areas that you want to include, or sorry, the assets that you want to include on your map. And one thing you don't see on this map that will actually happen is that your area that you selected will be highlighted on the map. But since this was the whole United Way area and we're zoomed into a little spot, we don't actually see that highlight there. But anyway, we see that we've added United Way agencies here, food pantries, and then financial assistance programs. Then you can go through here and select more and turn them on. And then also at this point, you have the opportunity to export that map to an image file, or you can also add this asset map to your report. And when you do that, it not only adds the map of the assets, but it also adds a list of those assets that are in your service area. And I'll show an example of that here in a few minutes. So moving on to step 4, defining opportunities. Really what's going on here is nothing really for you to do savvy-wise in this step, but here we've given you some guidance on things that you need to include in your assessment. So a lot of questions that you need to answer in your assessment, such as what are the most important issues for you and your organization to address? Are there disparities? If so, which groups are experiencing the disparities, and things like that. So just think of that as, a little bit of guidance, a little bit of advice on what you need to have in your assessment. So that brings us to step 5. Really kind of the whole reason that we've been doing all this work is so that we can download that Word document. So really all you do at this point is click the button, download as MS Word document. It might take a minute or so for it to download, but once it downloads, it's just a plain old Word document, and you can edit it, make whatever changes you like. So we put in this picture here for you. If you don't like it, you can put your own picture in. This is your assessment title and your geography name, and you can make changes to that at this point. Created by you on such and such a date. And this is one of those things that goes in automatically to the report, the overview map of the area that we created. The dashboard also goes in, and it looks a little bit different, but all those elements are there along with all the colors. So you might see the data varies a lot. The data availability varies a lot by what geography you're looking at. You might see big chunks of the table here that have no data, maybe because that data is just not available by census tract. So this 211 call data, it's only available by counties right now, not by census tract. So if you're doing census tracts, you'll see a bunch of blanks here. But again, it's just a table in a Word document, so you could select those areas and delete them and so on. Or you can highlight certain areas, you know, whatever you like. Any visualization that you had chosen to add will also be in the Word document, and you can make changes, you know, adding text and whatnot to explain the map or the visualization, and all the other visualizations that you had added, including the asset map that we see here. So let me show a quick example. I'm not going to go through creating a whole new assessment, but I will show you. So here I've clicked on Start Your Assessment, and we see all the other assessments that I had created in the past. And so if you come back here and you want to view the assessment that you created later, it takes you here. It takes you to the Define Scope page. You'll see that what I did here is basically the Martindale-Brightwood neighborhood. I can't, it's grayed out here because I can't make any changes to it, like it said before, because once you define an area, you're stuck with it. So if you don't like this area, you got to create a new assessment. And I see all the I see the dashboard here with all the data. I can click on these drill downs here to get a little bit more information. So if I want to view, this is percent of population with a disability. So I see the disability rate in that neighborhood is a lot higher than, you know, Indianapolis and Indiana. I can export an image of this visualization, add it to my report. I can, depending on what we're looking at here, I can change the drill down. So as you would expect, the disability rate for older people is going to be a lot higher than those for younger people. And step 3, identifying assets. So I could look at food pantries in the area, and here you see on the map how my area is highlighted, and financial assistance programs, and anything else that I want to add. Also at this point, you can click on these symbols on the map and get a little bit more information about those specific assets. So I see this is St. Vincent de Paul food pantry, and so on. So I could add the map to the report. I've already added it to this report, and we'll see it later. And then from here, moving on to step 4, here we're just telling you some things that you need to address in your community assessment. And then finally, you know, the whole reason we're here, going to step 5, and then downloading that Word document. And I'll say that Word document, you know, it's not the end of your community assessment, but it's kind of the end of the beginning, where, you know, you download it. And there's a lot of you know, work left to do here, but we've kind of given you that framework. So, you know, acknowledgments if you want to, you know, the purpose, and so on, some methodology and definitions, a table of the area that we selected, a map of the area, that dashboard, And then these are visualizations that I had been adding along before when I was doing this. And then the community assets map. And then also what you hadn't seen before is a list of those assets as well. And you could add multiple asset maps in there as well. So you might do one for food pantry, and might do one for libraries and other types of assets. And there's, placeholders we've put in here where you need to further develop your community assessment, and then a list of data sources boiled down, to that brief list. So that's our community assessment tool. I'd like to thank everybody for attending today. If you have any questions after today, feel free to call or email. So there's my contact information. And then if I'm not around, you can call the front desk number there, or use the SAVI email address. And the last thing, I'll put this contact information back up, but the last thing I'm going to ask is that you fill out the course evaluation. And let me put that link into the chat log so you can just click on it.
Hey, Jay, I was wondering, so I'm pretty new to this, and I'm not really sure, and I'm sure that I can probably find it somewhere, but I was wondering if you could tell me a quick way to access, or maybe we want to narrow down a specific area. So let's just say the Martin Luther King area, but I understand that it goes all the way to maybe Meridian Street. So the only way to narrow that down is to have a census tract number, or is there another way that I can quickly do this in SAVI? I missed the first part of this, so I'm sorry about this.
Okay, no problem. So let me start a new.
And I don't mean I missed the first part of this webinar, but I didn't get to sit in on, I guess, the basic class. So,
okay. I see what you're saying. Yeah. So let's say you kind of know your geographic area. But you don't know census tract numbers. So it's just a matter, once you get to the define scope step, you're going to change your drop down here and select census tracts. And then you zoom into your area. And then from here, it's just a matter of clicking on the map to select the census tracts that you want. So,
perfect. Okay.
Yeah, so if you know the streets, you can just click on it from street to street. And so sometimes you got to make some decisions with these census tracts. So you might think it stops at Michigan Street, but like this census tract, it's either include all of it or include none of it. So
okay, and I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but where are you now? I'm on my iPhone, so I can barely see this. So what tab are you on, or where is this?
Oh, I see. So I clicked, I was on Start Your Assessment, and I've filled in those 3 text boxes, the name of the assessment, the geography, and the purpose. And then you click Next or Save at that point. It takes you into the tool. And then at this point, it's step 1, define scope, where I'm interacting with the map and clicking on it.
Okay, I can figure that out. Perfect.
Okay.
That was the one question we had, so good. Okay.
All right. Yeah, so if you have any other questions, feel free to call or email, and we can help you get over those issues. All right, so let me put my, so if you can do that course evaluation, the link's in the chat log there. I'll put my contact information back up if you need that information. So I'll hang out for a minute. If everybody has any other questions, feel free to type them out in the chat log, or just unmute yourself, and we can figure those things out. But other than that, I'd just like to thank everybody for attending today, and I hope to talk to you in the future. Bye.